Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm glad that so many people signed up for this presentation, this event today. Today, we will talk about global perspectives on migration, overcoming cultural barriers. That is part of the Abitur topic. You probably will be doing soon or taking your exams soon. My name is Katrin Wittner, and I coordinate the school programs at the DAZ, that's the German American Center in Stuttgart. And I would like to welcome Lauren Frick first. Hi, Lauren. Thank you so much for being here today. And before I introduce her properly, I want to tell you a little bit about the DAZ and, of course, about today's event. Let me tell you a little bit about the DAZ first. Though some of you probably have already heard about us, the German American Center is a cultural institution and an educational institution dedicated to informing about the United States and fostering German-American relations. In addition to a diverse cultural program, we offer English classes taught by American teachers. We also have a library, and we offer advice for local teenagers and young adults who are interested in educational opportunities in the US. Today's event is part of our school programs, which also include presentations and workshops for school classes, as well as teacher trainings. Online events like this one have become a regular part of that work, and today's session is specifically designed for high school students preparing for the Abitur exams, and it's serving as a review and a summary of the topic. I'd also like to take a quick moment to mention two related events you might find helpful. We hosted a similar event focused on migration and identity last month. And last year, we had an online talk with Sefi Atta, the author of the short story Green, where we explored her story in the context of the Abitur topic. And recordings of both events are available on our YouTube page. We just finished editing the recording of last month's event. And I'll send the link to everyone in the chat in a few moments. So maybe you can check that out as well if you are still preparing for the Abitur. Today's session will also be recorded and uploaded there. So you will find the recording of this event later there too. Before we get started, a few quick notes on how Zoom works for this presentation. Your microphone and camera will be turned off, but you're very welcome to ask questions at any time using the Q&A, or in German, probably the F und A tool. And we genuinely encourage you to do so, ask many questions. We'll pause regularly throughout the presentation to address questions, and there will also be time for open questions at the end, of course. So, now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Lauren Frick, as I've already mentioned. Lauren holds a bachelor's degree in history and did a master's program in international conflict. She works as a teacher and speaker for the German American Center and has been teaching English for many years. Lauren specializes in Abitur relevant content. And in fact, she just wrapped up another course with Abitur students over the Easter break. So she's very much in the topic right now. Lauren, I'm really glad to have you with us today. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insight again.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And thank you guys so much for being here this afternoon and taking the time to listen to this presentation. I hope it helps. And like she said, if you have any questions, please feel free. I will try my very best to answer them. So what I would like to do with this presentation is talk a little bit more globally. If you were here for the last one, it was a little bit more focused on kind of personal narration. And this, we're going to look a bit more globally. So first, we're going to talk about some of the facts and the trends concerning global migration and the effects that migration is having on societies. Then we will look at some cultural barriers that migrants face, things like language, getting used to different customs, how people are treated in their new communities, things like this. And then we will also look at institutional barriers. Sometimes this is called structural barriers, which are in place by governments, different policies and laws that either make it harder or easier for migrants to come to the new place. So predominantly we will be focusing on the US, but because, we're talking globally here, and because I know you need it for your Abby, we'll also look towards Europe, specifically to the UK, because a few of our short stories take place in the UK, and also a bit about Germany, right? Because we all live in Germany. So that's what I have planned for you. Let's dive right in. Why is this topic important? Well, come on. It's your Abby, of course, but it's not just the Abby. I really love this topic that they've created because it's so important. It's, if we look at the last decade in particular, it has become a driving force in the world. It's profoundly affecting, politics in not only Western Europe, but United States, kind of globally. And it's having major impacts on, society and public opinion. If we look at voters in Germany again and the United States, especially in the last decade, what they consistently say is that number one, economy is the most important factor. But number two, usually, is immigration. Voters care deeply, deeply about this issue. It's very controversial, it's very complex, which of course means that we need to look closer at it, right? So, the world is very much on the move, to steal the Abby title. So in 2020, there were 280 million global migrants. So by this global migrants, it's kind of like all the different types of migrants, including like asylum seekers, economic migrants, all of them together. So if we, put that number into percentage, it's about 4% of the world's close to, at this point now in 2026, 8 billion people. So if we put this into perspective, what this means is that, okay, in 2020, it was China as the world's most populous country. Now it's India. So India is number one, and then China, and then the United States. But then in fourth place, it would be migrants, like if they form their own country. It's a ton of people, really an astounding amount of people. And so what that means for us, especially, is that, more people equals more cross-cultural encounters. Let's look specifically now at kind of Germany and the US. So what you'll see here on the left is the breakdown of the people in Germany in 2022 who have some kind of a migration background, right? So at the top here, we see 24.3% in Germany have some kind of migration background. And what's funny is last night I was sitting in the car and I was listening to SVR Dry, and the news came on at 6 o'clock, and they said that this number, they recently announced the kind of new numbers, and that this has slightly increased to 25%. So now it's kind of 1 in 4, every fourth person has kind of a migration background in their history. So that number is gradually increasing. Now, if we look at the US, obviously we are quite famed for our migration history. But what you'll see here is a trend, right, over the decades, up, 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 up. So if we come here, if you focus here on 2020, this shows us that 47.9 million people were foreign born. So the foreign born in this context means like they live in the United States, but that they were born in a different country. So they're first generation immigrants. And those numbers as a percent of the total population. So 47.9 million as 14.3% of the total population. Now keep in mind that this is only showing us foreign born. It's not showing us kind of like how it is in German with the immigration background, because, arguably everybody in the US has an immigration background at some point in their family history, except for, Native Americans. But, the main takeaway from here is that, both Germany and the US, we are very much living in a multicultural society. So these, cross-cultural encounters happen often and routinely, right? Okay, so some more just kind of basic data for you. Where are migrants coming from and where are they going? So this is looking at migrants, specifically non-asylum seeking migrants. So the people who are moving for, just a better job or better work opportunities, or students, or because their family, they're, reunifying with their family, these kind of programs. So in 2024, world's number one was India. And if you joined us for the last presentation, we talked very much about, push and pull factors, and we discussed a lot of the reasons why people are being pushed out of these countries. In India, for example, it's a giant population, right? It's world number one in terms of population, and they have a high youth unemployment rate. And so especially young people, they're moving around the world and they're trying to find better opportunities for themselves. And then we have Mexico, Russia, China, and the Philippines. So these people are moving mostly in search of economics, better job opportunities. And where are they going? Okay, well, in 2024, the top destination country still remains the US. We've been kind of historically very high for decades, centuries probably. It's still very much a global sanctuary. What will be interesting, though, looking to the future over the next few years, the 2025, 26 numbers, is how this changes, if it changes. It's forecasted to have a historic decline in net migration. So it means, more people are leaving than are coming. So that will be interesting to see. And that is very much a result of the current immigration policies under President Trump, which we will talk about a little bit at the end of the presentation. Germany in second place, Saudi Arabia, UK, France. And again, the pull factors. Why do people want to come to these countries? Well, a strong labor market, civil protections, civil rights, respect for human rights, democracy, etc. Now looking, because for me, it always makes sense to separate a bit of people coming for economic reasons and people coming for reasons such as like fleeing from persecution and conflict, so refugees. So they number about almost 1/2 of the total number of migrants worldwide. So earlier we said that there were, 304 million, and refugees account for 123 million. So just about 1/2 of all migrants are refugees which of course means, that they are fleeing because of torture, persecution, war, things like this, that their life is in danger if they stay in their home country. So in 2024, Venezuela was at the top of the list. And this is because, millions have had to flee because of, kind of a range of reasons. But number one, hyperinflation, like the economy basically collapsed. This has in turn led to massive unemployment, extreme poverty. People can't access kind of basic needs like food and clean drinking water, medicine. Not only that, but the government under Nicolas Maduro, who has made a lot of headlines in the last few months, right? Because he was arrested under President Trump. Afterwards, after the election, they had an election in 2024, and he goes after his political opponents, and thousands were arrested. So very anti-democratic, very authoritarian. So millions fleeing Venezuela. Syria, consistently over the last decade, since the war began in 2011, has been on the list. It's something like, I think, 1/4 of all Syrians had to leave the country. What's happened, this is 2024, so what's happened more recently, of course, is that the Assad regime in Syria fell. So the war is technically over. This happened in December of 2024. But of course, it's reason to hope and to celebrate, of course. But at the same time, the situation is quite unstable. So it's not yet a safe country for those who have fled. Afghanistan similarly has always been on the list since for years, for decades. So the Taliban officially took over again after the US withdrawal in 2021. However, like other countries here on the list, um, poverty remains, human rights issues remain, especially in Afghanistan for women and girls. Their rights have been severely restricted. So the situation is still very unstable. Ukraine, obviously, we know that the conflict is ongoing. And then the last place, in fifth place, is South Sudan, which is also one of the most dangerous spots on the earth. They have been they became a country. It used to just be Sudan, and now it's South Sudan. They became an official country back in 2011 after a civil war. But that kind of relative peace after the Civil War really only lasted a few years. And now it's fighting again. It's poverty. It's really a dire situation, disease, hunger. So refugees are obviously trying to leave that and find safety in other places. So, that asks the question, where are they going? So people are usually surprised by this because there's this kind of idea in the West that like all refugees are coming to Europe and the US. Well, they're actually not. Almost 70% of all refugees worldwide, they're hosted by neighboring countries, which if we look at a map, it kind of makes sense, right? Because logistically, it's way easier for people who are displaced to just walk or flee to their neighboring country, right? So Iran, for example, is number one as refugee host country. So almost all of the refugees in Iran are coming from Afghanistan. So again, if we look at the map, we're going to understand why. Turkey has almost all of the refugees coming from Syria. Colombia is hosting most of the refugees coming from Venezuela. Germany is mainly host to Syria, again, coming from 2016, the refugee crisis in 2016, but also Ukraine. And Uganda and Africa is mostly hosting South Sudan. So it makes sense, right, that the neighbors are helping. Okay, so if we turn our attention to some of the effects of this global migration. So we have, of course, positive and negative effects. One of the ones that I'm sure that you remember from your classes with this discussion is that the countries receiving, especially skilled workers, they get a brain gain. So, doctors and nurses and engineers, when they are forced to leave or when they choose to leave in search of better opportunities, the new country acquires those skills, right? So it's a plus for the country receiving them. So we get a brain gain. There's also vacancies in the labor market that need to be filled. We need workers. This is true in Germany. This is true in the United States. We need workers. Most economists will tell you that migration has a positive effect on the economy. More workers equals more spending, equals more taxes. It's, almost always a positive gain. The fourth factor here is, and this is a very important one, is that it's helping countries with an aging population. So you guys might have heard about this, but basically the world is getting old. It's rapidly aging. It's, what is it, 2 billion people by 2050 are going to be aged 60 or older. This has tripled since 2000. And the main countries affected, well, number one is Japan. Japan has a very, very old population. It's 28%, age 60 or more. And then in second place, Italy. And guess who's in third place? Germany. Germany has 22% aged 65 or older. And this means, you have to keep the system running. Germany needs young workers paying into the system, right? The next factor is new innovation and ideas. And I always think of the many examples in the US of immigrants who have, came over to the US and then went on to create really successful businesses. We have a very rich history of entrepreneurship. So, for example, I'm not sure if you guys knew about this, but the founder of Google, whose platform I used earlier to upload this presentation with difficulty. So the founder of Google, I think there were two guys, right? But one of them was, what was his name? Sergey Brin. He actually immigrated to the United States from the Soviet Union when he was a child. I think at like 6 years old or something. And then he went on to found Google. We have so many examples of this. I mean, Steve Jobs is another example. He was actually born in the US. I think he was born in San Francisco, but his father was from Syria and he moved to the United States from Syria to go to university, right? So we have a really rich history of migrants coming over and they bring this innovation, they bring new ideas with them. And then, the last one is cultural diversity. This is one of the main benefits of globalization, right? That now in terms of, the arts and music. We have different influences from different cultures. When this presentation ends, it's going to be about 6 o'clock, which is about dinner time, right? If you eat early like me, which means, the question, okay, what are we eating for dinner? So you have the choice now to think, what am I in the mood for? Should we get Greek, or we could have Japanese, or we could have Italian, or we can have Mexican, right? Thank you, cultural diversity, that we have so many different options. On the other hand, of course, there are some negative aspects. So for the country, like comparing again, going back to the top, brain gain versus brain drain, for the country who is losing that skilled worker, it's horrible, right? So this happened, we can look at, Ukraine, Syria as recent examples of this, where it's like kind of the best and the brightest are leaving the country. And these countries like Ukraine and Syria, they need skilled workers, especially like Syria now that they're in the process of trying to rebuild. They need professors, they need doctors, they need engineers, they need nurses. They need them back in the country. You could also make the argument in different sectors that more people equals more competition for jobs. And it's, kind of basic economy that if there's an oversupply, then what's going to happen is that wages go down. So that's an argument. Another one is that it's a strain on public services. So, think of a place like Stuttgart, right? We have a relatively high number of migrants. And what this means is just kind of like more people equals more demand on infrastructure. On the roads, there's more traffic. In the schools, there's more children trying to make, doctor's appointments. There's just more of a demand, which means that the wait time will be longer. Housing, you guys are probably young enough that you haven't started looking for an apartment in Stuttgart, but when you do, let me warn you, it's really difficult because there's a very high demand and there's only so much available, right? And so the argument is that, migrants, as more people coming in, put a higher pressure on these public services. Overcrowding is kind of, similar to this. And then what we've seen, of course, with our own eyes, especially over the last decade, is that there is often in the public, there's, a backlash to migration, especially when there's times of mass migration, like what happened with the refugee crisis in 2016. We're seeing this very much now in the US, social disharmony. Okay, let's turn our attention a bit to cultural barriers. So first of all, what are cultural barriers? Okay, well, it's any kind of obstacle to communication or understanding or interactions with people from a different cultural background than you. If you were here for my last presentation a few weeks ago, you heard me mention this, but I'm going to do it again because it's, in my opinion, probably the most important lesson that we learn from this overall topic and from the short stories in the film. And that is just simply that we are going to have and keep having cross-cultural encounters because of, high migration rates, because of globalization. It's just going to keep happening. And so what that means is we as people have an individual choice to make when we have these cross-cultural encounters. We have kind of two options. We can either other the person, which means, kind of reacting with suspicion and hostility and fear, right? And putting them kind of in a separate group, like us versus them, right? Or we can bridge, which I'm sure you can see the symbolism behind this, right? Bridging between cultures means being open, being interested, being, having a willingness to perhaps learn something new. And so how migrants are treated, those who other and those who bridge in their communities, this has a major impact on their ability to feel a sense of belonging, to really integrate into their new countries. And arrival gives us the clearest possible example of this. Dr. Banks is our ultimate bridger, right? She approached the aliens with that openness. She wanted to learn their language. She was curious about them. She was patient. And in return, what happened? She learned their language and she received the gift. By learning their language, she was able to see time the way that they do. Russia and China, on the other hand, and parts of the American military, they reacted with fear, with aggression. They believed that the aliens were trying to attack them. And this is a very clear example of othering, right? We're going to talk more about it in a second. Also, in the short stories, what we can see is that the characters who were treated with openness, with acceptance, they in return had a mostly positive migration experience. Green, the third and final continent, and exterior paint. Now, exterior paint, let's be careful. Alphonse, he was treated very poorly by the community at large. The community at large was quite racist. However, he found Lillian, who gave him that bridge. And in return, he was able to live, apparently for the next, few decades in the United Kingdom, right? So it worked. We can count him as a good example. On the other hand, the characters who were treated with that kind of othering mentality, with suspicion and fear, they in return felt really isolated. They felt misunderstood. They often felt very depressed. We see this very clearly in A Soldier's Tale, Loose Change, The Thing Around Your Neck, and the Embassy of Cambodia, right? And so again, what happens is that the migrant, if they're treated with, bridging, they feel better, but also the person themselves also learn something. They feel better. When people are othered, it's negative for the migrant, but it's also, you lose the opportunity to ever kind of learn something, right? The opportunity to grow. So it's kind of, we have a win-win and we have a negative-negative. Okay. So one of the main cultural barriers that migrants face is, of course, the language barrier. And I can speak from personal experience here, moving to Germany and having to learn German. What we know is that all language learning is difficult. It takes time, but it is essential to full belonging, to really feel like you belong in the country. And indeed, what this graph shows us, look at these numbers here, 91%, and this was a graph based on like 21 countries worldwide. 91% of countries around the world said that being able to speak the country's most common language was really important to being for being truly accepted into the community. 91%, overwhelmingly. I mean, obviously, if you're living in a new country, You need language skills on a practical level. You know, you need to be able to go to the doctor, you need to be able to go shopping, you know, the kids need to be able to go to school and learn in the language. Um, but again, it's also that more emotional factor of feeling connected to others and being able to um, speak and have friendships with locals. So perhaps you've heard or seen kind of these viral videos going around in the last few years, especially on like TikTok or YouTube. And it's these viral videos about like people in America, like Spanish speakers, walking around in a grocery store or Walmart or wherever they are, and they'll be speaking Spanish to one another. And suddenly somebody comes up and kind of attacks them and says, you know, hey, you're in America. We speak English in America. Why are you speaking Spanish? Unfortunately, this kind of hostility towards Spanish has increased in the last few years. Um, and, you know, America, the melting pot, right? Um, the nation of immigrants, you know, for centuries, there was no official language. English was not the official language actually until last year in March when Trump signed an executive order saying that English was now the official language. And this is because, you know, there were over 350 languages spoken in homes around the country. Spanish, you know, Hispanics are the largest minority group in the US, so it's, you know, no surprise that Spanish is the second most common non-English language. Um, but again, recently there's this uptick in attacks against Spanish speakers. And I would say, you know, keep in mind that the prejudice isn't against Spanish so much as a language. It's about the people who speak Spanish. Spanish speakers who might tend to be of color, people who tend to be of a lower socioeconomic background, and who are often the target of very aggressive words coming from politicians who are choosing to kind of demonize these people and stereotyping them, right? So, okay, so let's go back to arrival for a second. So, again, approaching foreign language with hostility is, again, seen very much in arrival, and especially this common occurrence of having misunderstandings whenever there's like a language barrier. So again, with arrival, you know, Dr. Banks thinks that the heptapods are saying offer weapon. Or she argues, hey, it might not actually be weapon. It might also mean tool. So offer tool. One interpretation. China, of course, argues it's not so peaceful. It's aggressive. They're saying use weapon. They're saying that they're going to attack us. And so in response, what do? They break off communication. They stop talking with them. They issue an ultimatum, which means they told the aliens, you know, you have 24 hours to leave Earth or we're going to attack you. So we know at the end of Arrival that Dr. Banks was right. But again, this kind of cultural misunderstandings from language happen a lot. Okay, the next one that I would like to discuss is customs and traditions in terms of cultural barriers. You know, every country has its own customs that they would like respected by newcomers. That makes sense, right? Of course. The issue is that sometimes Just like with language, first of all, it takes a little bit of time to get used to these new customs and traditions for migrants. And sometimes people accidentally offend locals, not because they're trying to be disrespectful, but quite simply just because they don't know any better, that they're just ignorant of the customs. I can tell you a good example that happened to me a couple years ago. It was very embarrassing. I went to a wedding in Greece, and the wedding took place in a Greek Orthodox church. I had never been there to a Greek Orthodox church before, but I was sitting in my chair, and at one point during the service, I crossed my legs, as women, tend to do here. And there was a man, an older gentleman, who was sitting close to me. And he immediately kind of, shot his eyes over and he looked at me and he was very angry, I could see. And he started waving his finger at me, going, and I was like, oh my gosh, what did I do? And then I didn't know what to do, so I just like put my legs back on the ground. And then I was, very embarrassed and oh my gosh, what have I done? And then afterwards, I talked to one of my Greek friends and I said, what happened? I didn't mean to upset anybody. And he said, oh, okay, yeah, in a Greek Orthodox church, it's considered very rude for women to cross their legs. I had no idea. Did you guys know that? I didn't know, right? So again, it's, this unfortunate misunderstandings happen, and it's unfortunate, but oftentimes it's not out of aggression or disrespect. It takes time, like I said, to get to know these things. In the US, we have what others might consider kind of a strange tradition, but every American knows that you have to do it, and that is at a sporting event. Usually when the national anthem is being played, you have to stand up out of your seat and you have to put your hand over your heart. And if you don't, it's considered extremely rude, extremely rude. Others don't know this tradition, right? But what we see here, going back to our graph here, is that, number one was language, that this is in first place of what people consider the most important. But sharing these countries' customs and traditions, this is in second place. 81% said that it is important in order to truly belong in a new place. So some other cultural barriers that migrants might face, of course, having a different religion from the mainstream society. It could be food or dietary restrictions. So I was thinking about this last year over the summer. My little neighborhood where I live, it's kind of like a small town, and the neighbors are pretty cool. And they organize like a block party, we would call it, like a little grill party with the neighbors every summer. And one of the neighbors is Muslim. And so it was a little bit, it could be potentially kind of problematic because Muslims have strict rules about how the meat can be slaughtered. I think it's called halal, probably mispronouncing that. But the problem was solved by just quite simply, he has his own grill and he brings his own meat, and everybody else has different meat and a different grill, and it's no problem. You kind of find a way to overcome these barriers. Societal values, different clothing styles, these could also be, potential problems. But again, like we talked about last week with this, idea of assimilation and multiculturalism, what's most important and what sociologists say helps migrants the most is being able to find kind of a balance, being able to keep aspects of your background and your identity while at the same time incorporating, using new influences in the country. So, my favorite example is the third and final continent, because the narrator, he's in an arranged marriage, right? Which is obviously a very, very Indian practice. However, on the first day that they're living together, he tells Mala, his wife, after she cooks him a traditional Bengali breakfast, he tells her, I just like cornflakes in the morning for breakfast. Right. And the first time I read that short story, I just kind of had a little laugh because to me, that's kind of really finding that cultural balance. Okay. A quick word on how we think about different cultures. So, the first way is called ethnocentrism, which is basically like using your own culture as a frame of reference to judge or think about other cultures. It's like, oh, well, in the West, we do it like this, so it must be right. Well, no, it's not right or it's not wrong. It's just kind of how we do it here. And the problem is when we look at other cultures and say, you're wrong because you do it differently. I'll give you a great example. So think in your head, how would you feel in Germany if you were on the S-Bahn and the S-Bahn was almost totally empty and you're like, yay, I get to sit by myself and I have plenty of room, right? And how would you feel if suddenly somebody came and sat right next to you when there were all these seats available, especially women? You would probably feel uncomfortable, right? Annoyed, maybe scared. And this is because in the West, we value personal space, right? We like to have our personal space. Now, in contrast, let me tell you a story. I have a good friend who is from South Africa, and I never knew this, but she told me that if there was an almost empty bus in South Africa, it would be considered rude to not sit next to the person, that it would be rude to sit away from them. And I was kind of shocked by that because to us, that seems so foreign, right? And she says that it's because in South Africa, their culture really values kind of like unity and community and making, like having that kind of physical closeness is a way to show these values of kind of warmth and connection. And I was just blown away by that, right? Does that mean that South Africans are wrong? No, of course not. Does it mean we're wrong? No, of course not. It's just what we, as our culture, say what we value, right? So sociologists are going to argue that the best way to think about cultures is through what's known as cultural relativism. And this just means, try not to look at a culture from the outside in. Instead, try to understand why there are these different cultural practices from within their own culture. What are the reasons? What's the history behind it? What are the values, right? There's a reason for things. So try to understand the reasons instead of just looking kind of from the outside in and judging it. Okay. Ah, okay. So now what I will do is talk a bit about institutional barriers. Sometimes this is called systemic barriers, and really it's just, the obstacles in place by governments that either make it easier or harder for migrants. First of all, it's important to remember, of course, every country in the world has immigration policies, immigration laws, but some are easier and some are harder. So I don't know if you guys know about this, but there's quite a few countries where you can become a citizen within a few months, typically if you have a lot of money. So in Turkey, for example, if you want to get citizenship, it only takes like 3 months if you invest about 400,000 into the economy, which a lot of people do. It's actually quite common. Malta is another example. Here you need a bit more. It's like 750,000. Portugal has a similar kind of scheme where you can have a streamline, which means like fast citizenship track if you invest a certain amount into the country. And St. Kitts was on the list, which I had to include because that reminded me of Alphonse from Exterior Paint. That's where he comes from. So easier countries, some of the world's hardest. And this was actually very interesting for me to research because I didn't know about this. But like Qatar, for example, really, really hard. Like if you ever want to move there and become a citizen, forget it. You have to spend, I think it was 30 years continual residency, which means you have to prove that you live there for 30 years without breaking it up. And you have to be fluent in Arabic, and then like a whole bunch of other requirements. Switzerland is also famously difficult, but compared to Qatar, it's actually maybe a little bit easier. It was like 10 years of residency compared to 25. North Korea, it's basically impossible to get citizenship. China is also extremely difficult. Japan as well. You have to show that you have a blood relative um, in order to get it. So you can't just like move there from not having Chinese blood. Okay, so basic point, some hard, some easy. Let's look at the US. Of course, the US has many different pathways to for migrants available. Some of the most common include, the different types of visa programs, family reunification. So if you say my husband was offered a job in the US and now he's working there, then I can apply to join him as a family member. And also that would apply for our children. And you could also say, your extended family. Work visas, humanitarian need. We're going to talk a little bit more in detail about that in terms of refugees. The green card lottery, which is what Acuna, the character and the thing around your neck, she won the lottery, right, and got the visa to come over. And different highly sought skills. So we have what's known, it's nicknamed like the Einstein visa. So if you can show that you are exceptionally skilled in your area, then we want you, right? Because that's brain gain. We want you to come over. We want your skills. Of course, if those options aren't available, some migrants choose to come without documents. So the most common way for them to come over is, first of all, to enter legally, but then to overstay. So most countries would be, the US government gives them like 90 days or something to come over, and then they would just enter on their 90-day tourist visa, but then just overstay. Or, of course, to cross the southern border, which we've heard a lot about in the news recently, crossing the southern border. I assume that you guys talked about DACA in school, but I consider it quite important, so I want to just give you a little refresh real quick. So the DACA program is for undocumented children specifically. So it was created under President Obama in 2012. It stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, but everybody just calls it DACA. And what it did was it said, we know that there are millions of undocumented children who are living in the United States. And what we want to do is offer them protection so that they can kind of come out of the shadows and live a full life in the United States without fear. It gave protection from deportation. It wasn't a pathway to citizenship, but it did offer protection from deportation and the right to work and not having to work, kind of under the table, kind of secretly, right? So these children are called the dreamers, which I assume again that you've heard about the dreamers. And what kills me is that the first time I read the Southside Raza short story, at the end of it, when we find out that, Shadow was actually undocumented, I was so upset because I'm like, Shadow, you could have been a dreamer. Like he would have been the kind of person who could apply for this program. Right, it's all these different eligibility rules, but basically, if you were brought to the US like by your parents as a child under the age of 18, um, if you can show that you're in school or that you're working, or if you want to study, you can't have any kind of criminal record, then you would be eligible for it. So since the beginning, really in 2012, when Obama created this program, he's faced a lot of legal challenges and criticisms from Republicans mostly, saying that, we can't protect these people, they're undocumented, they need to be deported. And so what's happened is currently the program still does exist, but it's been frozen. So what that means is there's no new applications allowed, but the protections are still in place for a little bit over 500,000 people. But for them, they've had to live for over a decade with uncertainty because this DACA has been being battled back and forth in the courts. And it will be probably a few more years before it gets to the Supreme Court. And then the Supreme Court can hopefully make a final judgment, a final ruling on this program. And then we'll know once and for all if it's going to stay or if it's going to go. Okay. Looking now towards President Trump and what's kind of going on currently. So we all know that his signature issue during the campaign was immigration. He promised to crack down heavily on undocumented migrants. So, estimates vary, but it's believed to be about like 11 million to about 13.7, let's say 14 million undocumented migrants in the US. And so the question has always been, what do we do with them? We know that they're here. Do we deport them or do we try to do what, Obama did and give them certain protections? And so Trump, is very no nonsense on this. He says that if you are undocumented in the US, then you have no legal right to be in the country and that you need to be removed. And so what he's doing is he has made agreements with what's known as like third countries. So third countries are countries where it is considered safe to send deportees. So, for example, Venezuela. You can't send somebody back to Venezuela right now because they have a legitimate claim that their life could be in danger. So it's against international law to send a person back to Venezuela. However, what you can do and what Trump is trying to do is send them to a third country, not the US, not Venezuela, but a third country. And so he's made some deals with about, I think it's like 30 countries, mostly in Africa, and South America, where they have agreed to accept deportees from the United States. He also said that they could be sent back, or that they will be held in Guantanamo Bay, which, if you guys had any lessons in class about America after 9/11, then hopefully this word rings a bell in your head. The military prison in Cuba where suspects of terrorism were held after 9/11. So, what I would like to do, let's see if it works, but what I would like to do is show you a quick video about something I'm sure you've been hearing a lot about in the news, and that's ICE, right? ICE stands for the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, and they have been making headlines across the world, especially over the last year, because they are very aggressively targeting undocumented migrants in the United States. And their goal is to fulfill President Trump's promise to deport. So they have a lot of support from the right. Democrats, often on, those on the left, criticize ICE, saying that they are being too aggressive, that the tactics that they're using are too aggressive, that it's goes against the law. So let's watch this real quick, and then I'm sure we can have a few minutes to talk about it afterwards. So let's see if this works. Yes. Maybe.
Probably seen a lot of videos like these, showing masked anonymous agents dragging people off the streets into unmarked vans across the US. But how can ICE officers get away with doing all this? Get out. Can't even identify something. And as the agency is about to become the biggest law enforcement force in the country, next to Trump and his big budget bill, is what we're seeing just the beginning. But the key thing to know is that the agency we call ICE aren't actually police. You might think, because they're not police, that makes them less powerful. But under the Immigration and Nationality Act, the force actually operates with fewer constraints and less transparency than police do. For example, police officers are typically supposed to identify themselves, tell people why they're detaining them straight away, wear official uniforms, body cameras, have their faces uncovered. ICE agents don't have to do any of that. They do eventually have to tell you that they're immigration agents after your arrest. Now, Homeland Security claims ICE officers wear masks because they'd be doxxed if they didn't, but it's still a glaring accountability issue. Another really important thing to know is that being an undocumented migrant isn't a criminal offense. It's a civil one. This means that when ICE arrests people, specifically in a public setting, like a parking lot of a Home Depot, they don't need as much evidence. They can use something called an administrative warrant, which they issue themselves to arrest you. In some cases, they don't even need one. And that's only supposed to be if they have probable cause to believe you're in the US illegally and are likely to flee before they can get a warrant. But they're not supposed to use your profession, race, or appearance as the reason. If they want to arrest you in your home or another private space, ICE does need a warrant from a judge, but they can legally use these things called ruses, where they lie about who they are and why they're there in order to get you out of the house into a public space where all of a sudden they have more rights to arrest you. You're also not entitled to a government-provided lawyer. ICE aren't legally required to immediately inform your family members of your location. But look, what's happening right now isn't just because of what ICE is allowed to do on paper. It's political pressure from Trump and his loyalists to meet their ultimate goal.
Largest deportation program in American history.
The number of people without a criminal record who've been arrested by ICE has increased 807% since before Trump's inauguration this January. And according to internal emails, which The Guardian has seen, senior immigration officials are encouraging ICE agents to turn the creative knob up to 11 to increase detentions, including by arresting people they called collaterals, undocumented people who ICE coincidentally encounter while arresting others. And critics also say that ICE's aggressive and secretive practices are pretty blatant intimidation tactics. The fear is that they could get away with a whole lot more, especially as we're seeing activists get arrested and Trump threatened to expand ICE's brief to include his political opponents and even naturalized American citizens. So with thousands of new immigration officers about to hit the streets, it appears Trump is building the architecture of a new dominant law enforcement agency that lacks the same guardrails as others. Critics say the line between what is a federal law enforcement agency and what could be his own secret police is getting harder and harder to discern.
Okay, so a quick note about that. That video was from The Guardian newspaper, which if you guys know anything about them, it's a very kind of left-leaning British newspaper. So that was not biased or unbiased in any way. That was very critical of ICE and what's happening. But, of course, they do raise some interesting points here about what is legal, how they are going about it, and really kind of important issues that America is trying to kind of grapple with here. So a quick note more about ICE is that, first of all, this agency is relatively new. It was only created after 9/11. And their job is to deal with immigration law internally, like in the United States. If you've ever flown into an airport in the US, you're not dealing with ICE. You're dealing with what is it? Customs and Border Patrol. So that's a separate agency. So hopefully none of you guys have ever actually seen like ICE.
Lauren,
Yeah.
real quick, I just wanted to mention that we have a question. I think you're pretty much explaining or giving the answer right now. I just wanted to give it in there. So the question is, what is the main goal of ICE? So maybe just to give you the chance to get into that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so the main goal of ICE is to enforce domestic immigration law. So historically, what they've done, and they were, kind of relatively small before Trump's second term. And so what they would do is mostly do kind of different raids, maybe on like farms, if there were suspects of, a farm owner employing undocumented migrants. Then they would go in and they would check the papers of all the workers. And if there was anybody in violation of US immigration law, then they would be deported. So it's making sure that people in the interior of the country are following immigration law and that they're here with the right documents. But like I was saying, at the border, that's a separate agency. So there's the interior and then there's border protection. So in July of last year, President Trump passed a new budget with support of Congress, and he called it the Big Beautiful Bill. And the Big Beautiful Bill tripled ICE's budget. So that's what they were saying in the video, that this is on track to now become the largest agency. And it gave money to hire 10,000 new officers. So, it's quite clear what he's doing. He promised to do this, and that's what he's doing, is he's really cracking down and hoping to deport as many undocumented migrants as possible. So the numbers are a little bit tricky to find. I spent, a lot of time this morning trying to get kind of like exact credible sources for how many have been deported since he's taken office. But the government's website is not really keeping it up to date, but it's estimated that there's about 500,000 so far deported since he took office last year in January. So there's a lot of criticism, especially after last year, which I'm sure you guys heard about in the news, 2 Americans were shot and killed by ICE in Minnesota. They were protesting and they had a confrontation with ICE officers and they were shot dead on the streets. However, there still is support for what's happening. For many supporters, they say he's just keeping his promise and that this is something that needs to be done. So, we'll see how this plays out in the next few years, but this is very much having serious effects on kind of the harmony of communities, immigrant communities across the United States, because it's happening across all of the US. So what we see here is the daily arrests under the different presidents. So, what's funny looking back is that Obama, he was actually nicknamed the deporter in chief because he really focused the government's attention on deporting criminals. But he made it clear, in his policies that the focus was on criminals, not children. So it was really trying to go after kind of like the worst of the worst. And really, there's bipartisan support, like Republicans, Democrats. Most people agree that if you're a dangerous criminal, we don't want you in the country. You should be deported, right? It starts getting very controversial and upsetting when the public feels like the government is going after really vulnerable communities like women and children and those who are just simply trying to, live their life in peace, right? And so then we see Trump's first term still, higher than Obama, but still, relatively on average with previous presidents, and then, Biden. And now what we're seeing is the numbers are really just skyrocketing. So his goal, what he said, is that his goal is to deport 1 million per year. So we will see the numbers at the end of the year to see. Number 2 is he wants to end what's known as birthright citizenship. This is called the 14th Amendment. So basically, long story short, there's 2 different ways that you can get American citizenship or kind of citizenship in general from every country. So there's either it's an old Latin word, and I'm probably going to totally mispronounce it, but jus soli, meaning the right of the soil. So what this means is that if you were born on the soil of a country, then you have automatic citizenship. So the US has had this since the end of the Civil War. Also Canada, many countries in South America have it. The alternative, like what you guys have in Europe, is, oh gosh, what is it called? Jus sanguini, which means the right of the blood. So citizenship has to go through the parents, or in some cases, the grandparents. So this has been law in the United States since 1857, I believe. And this is because after the Civil War, the Supreme Court said that we have to protect the children of former slaves to make sure that they have the right to citizenship. So if you were born on American soil, you were automatically an American. So supporters say, this is the foundation for civil rights, that this is a part of our Constitution. However, Trump, on his very first day in office, he signed an executive order ending this. Now, the executive order was immediately challenged in the courts. He was immediately sued for this. And right now it's going through the process of the courts. Actually, the Supreme Court, I believe, is just started the hearing on this issue. So pay attention in the next few months and we'll find out what they have to say about it. But, you know, he's going to argue that we have to end birthright citizenship because it's abused. So there's what's known as birth tourism, which is mainly pregnant women who are coming to the United States when they're about, 8 months pregnant, right, about to give birth. And they're doing that in order to give birth in the United States so that their children, the baby, will have automatic US citizenship. So, he's saying that the system is being abused. So we'll see what happens there. But he's made it very, very clear that he wants to end this. The third goal of the Trump administration is to reduce the number of asylum applications. So, keep in mind, the right to asylum is an internationally protected human right since 1948 in the Geneva Conventions. And, the US has long been seen as that safe haven from persecution. However, presidents have a lot of power to set caps. So they can say how many are allowed to be accepted every year. And so, for example, under Biden, the cap was set at 125,000. And Trump has, I believe in 2025, he set the cap at 15,000, so considerably lower, right? And the 15,000 was giving priority to white South Africans who say that they are being persecuted against by the government. So considerably lower. It's a historic low. So in the beginning, he paused it completely, like he stopped the asylum process completely. Now it's going again, but there are about 40 countries who are completely banned from applicants being accepted. And he says that this is because of national security, that they have to, protect the national security of the United States, and certain citizens from certain countries cannot be allowed in. So again, what they're trying to do is remove these asylum applications to third countries, like what I was talking about earlier. Then, so, there's the asylum, but then there's also just kind of travel restrictions in general. So as of January 1st of this year, there's a total ban on citizens from 19 countries plus Palestine, and then a partial ban, which means like you might be allowed, you might not, but there has to be a really deep kind of background check before you're allowed to come in on over 20 countries. Here's kind of a quick look. So we see the full suspension, Afghanistan. Looking at the list quickly, it's a lot of African countries, Iran, no surprise they're on the list. Yeah, mostly African. And then the partial suspension, Africa, a little bit of the Caribbean, Cuba, African countries, and Venezuela. So predominantly African countries are on the restricted list. So another idea that the government has been pursuing is this idea of offering kind of a gold card for investors. And again, to be fair, like I was saying earlier, a lot of countries have these different programs where if you pay enough money and invest enough into the economy, then you will be given a visa or citizenship, Austria, Belgium, Greece. It's actually pretty normal. But this is the first time that it's been offered in the United States. And so, it raises a number of questions and obviously a debate. So the critics are going to say that, this is just too transactional. It's like we're selling citizenship, or we're selling visas to the rich. Whereas, supporters and Trump, he would argue that we want to attract high investment individuals, high wealth individuals, that they are going to be beneficial to the economy, and that these are the kind of people that are desirable in the United States. It's certainly changing, I would argue, like the social fabric of the United States. If we look back to the early 20th century, when we had, the first waves of migration coming to the New World, right? And the Statue of Liberty and the poem inscribed at the base of the Statue of Liberty by Emma Lazarus, which says, give us you're tired, you're poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. This idea that America welcomes the poor and the tired, right? The idea is, if you believe in democracy and believe in freedom and want to live in freedom, then come here, and we will give you a chance. We will give you opportunity, right? So that idea, it seems, has diminished considerably over the years, right? Okay. Let's take, in the time that we have left, we're running out of time. Let's take a quick look at Europe and some of the major issues that Europe is facing, specifically the migrant boat crossings. And I bring this up because two of our characters in the short story collection arrived in Europe from Africa in these migrant boats. So every year, thousands, we see here in 2024, 36,000 migrants crossed the English Channel trying to get into the UK, and 208,000, it's really an astronomical number, crossing from Africa to Europe. So let me show you the map real quick, and then it will make a bit more sense. So there's three different routes, if you can see my mouse here. So there's this western route going from Morocco into Spain, and then there's the central route. This is the most common and the most deadly. This is the one that I believe our characters, both characters in the short stories, took, leaving from Tunisia and trying to reach either Sicily or some of the smaller Italian islands. And then there's the eastern route here, going from Turkey and crossing into Greece. So every year, especially in the spring and the summer months, when the water is warmer and the weather's better, thousands and thousands attempt this. And every year we hear about drownings, that the boats capsize or that the boats sink and the migrants drowned, right? Then we have the English Channel. So this is also a very popular crossing. So for migrants who are already in Europe, they'll make their way up to France and try to cross the Channel. Now, the Channel, of course, is going to be a lot smaller than the Mediterranean. It's only about like 30 or 45 kilometers, but still extremely dangerous if you're in like a little rubber boat. And so the main area is they try to leave from the beaches of like Calais and Dunkirk. Where's Dunkirk on my map? Does it not even show? Oh, up here. So they try to leave from here, and then they go straight here to Dover, which is, of course, the most narrow part of the channel. And just like with the Mediterranean, what happens is, you know, traffickers, criminal groups will exploit these vulnerable people who are just trying to escape persecution and war, and they exploit them and take advantage and try to illegally smuggle them on these different routes. So, major issue. Governments are trying to figure out a way to stop these traffickers, stop the boats, and to go through, you know, the correct pathways. But every year there seem to be more and more. Looking at the UK for a moment, so, you know, the UK had a huge growth in multiculturalism, especially after the Second World War, because this is when the empire fell apart and the Commonwealth began. And they said that colonies, former colonies, had the right to move to the United Kingdom. And this increased, especially after World War II, because the economy needed workers. It was very similar to, you know, Germany, for example. They had this policy with, what is it called? The Gastarbeiter, right? This idea that come over and work here because we need workers. So quickly, let me pull out what's known as the Windrush scandal. And I bring this up because Alphonse in Exterior Paint, he was a part of this. And so basically in the 1950s, it was the UK government telling the Caribbean, you have the right to come over and live in the UK because we need you as a worker. But then the scandal began because in the 1950s, the Windrush workers were not given paper work. They were not given official documents saying that they were allowed to live and work in the United Kingdom. So in 2018, suddenly it comes out that the Home Office had sent letters to these people or their descendants saying, hey, what are you doing here? You're not allowed to be here. And so thousands were threatened with deportation, or in some cases actually deported from the UK. And many of them had been actually, like the descendants, of course, had been born in Britain. So think of Alphonse if that term comes up, the Windrush generation. Very quick note on Brexit is that in some ways, you know, we can think of Brexit as an attempt to regain control of immigration policy. One of the main messages from the Leave campaign during Brexit was, you know, that immigration policy should be decided from London and not Brussels. And again, looking at the data, what we see is that those who voted to leave agreed with the statement that multiculturalism in society was negative overall, that it was a force for ill, meaning that, you know, it didn't bring any positive benefits. And then the last issue here I would note is the factors concerning immigration in Germany. As we all know, in 2015, 2016, it was the height of the refugee crisis, and Germany allowed about 1 million Syrians to flee Syria. and find safety in Germany. Fast forwarding now almost 10 years, Chancellor Merz, he's announced that because the war in Syria has ended and the Assad regime has collapsed, he's saying that it's time for the refugees to go back. So about 22,000 Syrians to date have done that. They voluntarily said, okay, I'm going to go back now. And of course, there is pressure from politics, AFD, for example. You know, they heavily campaign on this issue that, you know, multiculturalism is not great for German society. And so they would very much like migrants to voluntarily choose to leave. So we'll see what happens over the next few years with this. I would point out that, you know, it's not just so simple like, oh, the war's over, we're just going to pick up, you know, pack our bags and get on a plane. You know, most of these Syrians have been living in this country for, you know, 10 years. They're working, their children are in school. It's not just a black and white, I'm in, I'm out. It is a process, and it will take a few years to develop. So, but we'll see what happens. And then another last fact for you that I was surprised about, I didn't know about this, but there's over, you know, like 6,000 Syrian doctors now working in the German healthcare system, which the healthcare system needs these workers, right? These skilled workers. They got the brain gain from these migrants. So again, it's not just a simple in or out. It's going to have effects on society in the future. So we'll see. Ultimately, and I know I talked way a lot, and I probably overwhelmed you guys with information, but your main takeaways is that, you know, in order to really effectively integrate into society, migrants have a number of cultural and institutional barriers that they have to overcome. Secondly, because of globalization, because of technology, migrants nowadays in 2026 are on the move. We have high immigration rates, and it's forecasted to continue, which means challenge and also opportunity, pros and cons, right? And lastly, I would just reiterate here that more migration means more cross-cultural encounters, and that we all need to think for ourselves and decide, how do we react when we have a cross-cultural encounter? Do we other? Do we bridge? These are your main lessons, I would say, from this topic and for your Abby. So what kind of questions can I answer for you guys? And I'm sorry I'm going a little bit over time, but if you have anything that you would like to ask, or if I went too fast in a section, which would probably definitely happen, then please let me know. I'd be happy to answer anything you got.
So we don't have any questions right now. The first one is coming in. I just wanted to mention, of course, everyone who has to leave, we're not angry with you if you want to go or have to go, but we will stay a little longer for everyone who wants to ask questions. Okay, so I've got a question about the analysis. My first teacher told me to use present progressive, but my second teacher now said that you should never use the present progressive and rather use simple present. What do you say about that? So not about the topic, more about the
totally off topic, but I will answer it for the Abby. So when there's what's known as the literary present tense. And so what your teacher probably means is that when you're writing about the plot or when you're saying, like in the article, the author says, then yes, you do need to be using that simple present, but don't get too crazy with it because this has to do more with grammar. Sometimes there are verbs that can only be used in the present progressive, and sometimes there are verbs that can only be used in the simple present. But overall, you need to be writing in the present when you're describing the plot, when you're talking about the short stories, when you're summarizing what was in an article, then yes, present forms.
Okay, great. So next question is back to the topic. Could you repeat the pros and cons of Brexit, please?
So I didn't have the pros and cons of Brexit. I just briefly mentioned it in the context of immigration, and that one of the pros that the Leave campaign said was that like London has the power to decide its own migration laws instead of it coming from the EU and Brussels, like them deciding it. But I do not have enough time to talk to you all about Brexit. It was just one quick little thing about Brexit, but you should have that somewhere, right?
And I think it's also kind of a con for the UK to now have to deal with a lot of issues on their own. So that's like it has the pros and cons in it, probably.
Right. In terms of
bit.
migration, but of course, there's going to be a ton of other factors, but
Yes, of course. I mean, that's just like a few two examples for pros and cons in this context.
Yeah.
So one more question here. How can you specifically connect the movie Arrival to the topic of migration? Because the topic seems to focus much on communication.
So we relate it to migration in terms of like our reaction to the migration. So do we react by othering, which is like fearing the newcomer, fearing the foreigner, or do we react by bridging, which is trying to understand the foreigner? That's how I relate it to migration, how we treat people when we have a cross-cultural encounter.
And it's also, I think, it also shows how important communication is to understand what the other person wants.
Right.
Or, like I always thought that was interesting about the movie, that you need you need to be able to communicate. So the language factor is like a really important issue. And of course, the question is the society that is already here like welcoming, trying to help, trying to understand, trying to support them, or not? So being back to othering.
Exactly. And what happens when there are these kind of misunderstandings because of the language barrier and how they can be interpreted? Yeah, absolutely.
Next question is, why did shadow not apply for DACA?
I mean, it was just a short story, so we don't know. I don't know, but I wish he had.
Next question is, first of all, a comment, great presentation.
Oh, thank you.
And the question is, how relevant is this content for the Abitur itself? Does it serve more as a background knowledge for various tasks that will be given? I'd assume that more often than not, some level of material is given during the exam. No?
Right. I mean, so your overall Abby topic is on the move, migration, and cross-cultural encounters, which is such a very, very large umbrella, right? Sorry for you guys, but you need to be prepared for any number of kind of subtopics that might come up. And so what we talked about a few weeks ago, what we talked about today, these are subtopics within that I think are the most important and could come up. We don't know what your text is going to be. It could be, if you choose like a literary text, it could be a short story about somebody who moved to the United States and they had cultural misunderstandings with the locals and they couldn't feel a sense of belonging. Or it could be somebody more currently who is trying to escape persecution in Venezuela, and it describes like their trek to try to reach safety in the United States only to be turned down. I don't know. I wish I knew what was coming for you guys in a few weeks. But I would say having general knowledge and kind of a wide range of, understanding with this topic is critical. So hopefully, that's what we are trying to prepare you for. But bottom line is expect anything.
Probably,
Not,
yeah.
not to scare you, but something from here-ish. And of course, what your teachers have been teaching you in the class lessons are,
Yeah.
are critical. They know more than I do. This is just kind of my opinion about if I was an Abby teacher or if I was the one making your test, what I would say you need to know.
Yeah. Okay, so let me, first of all, we have comments about shadow, and that's interesting because I didn't think about that. To answer the question why shadow did not apply for DACA, the short story is from 2011. DACA wasn't
Oh,
introduced at the time, so DACA started in
nice.
2012. So two
All
people
right.
gave us that feedback. Thank you so much.
Very good catch. And I apologize for not knowing that. I get my
And
book out.
I have one more question that I can answer. So is there a way to go back to the wonderful slides you compiled for this meeting? I thought I had sent it in the chat, but I just saw that it didn't work somehow. I will send out an email to everyone afterwards with the link to our playlist where we have this, like on YouTube, where we have this presentation, the presentation from last month, and also the Sefi Atta interview. So if you want to check that out later there, I will send it out to everyone by email later. Okay, and one more thing, one more question here. Which short story do you like the most of the 8 and why?
Oh, okay. Oh, that's hard. I really I suppose I liked Exterior Paint the most, just because I love history. And so I loved hearing about kind of 1950s, 1960s Britain. I loved how Malcolm X, one of the main civil rights leaders, was shown and portrayed in the short story, and that he became such a source of inspiration for Alphonse. And it was a happy ending. Everybody loves a happy ending. So I loved that. And I would also say I really liked Loose Change. But, for the opposite reason, I kind of felt like hit in the face when I got to that ending. And I was like, wow, she just left. It was a little bit shocking, but I also felt like that reaction was something that most people could identify with. It's kind of the honest truth about how most people feel when they're dealing, like if somebody comes up to you on the streets and they start asking for help, most of us feel immediately uncomfortable. We don't like to admit it, but it's the truth. And I felt like that story was shockingly honest.
I like that
Um,
about it too. I like
yeah.
that too about the
hmm
story. Like
hmm
and at the same time feeling ashamed about it, but
Exactly.
how it is a lot of
Exactly.
fun. Yeah,
We turn a blind eye to the struggles of
yeah,
people
yeah,
often.
yeah.
But overall, I thought that most of the stories were really great. I mean, I would probably argue For me, Embassy of Cambodia was the hardest to get through, and also A Soldier's Tale. I liked both stories, but I found some of the details to be hard to keep track of. Like with Salim and A Soldier's Tale, it's like, okay, he was born in Eritrea and then he moved here and then he went there and then so like that was a little bit hard to keep track of, but overall I liked the message of all the stories, really. I thought they did a good job of picking them.
Yeah, and I also think it's great to have a few like different stories and have different viewpoints
Perspectives,
and
yeah,
perspectives and
for
different
sure.
stories. Some happy endings and some are not so happy.
Right,
But yeah,
right.
yeah,
It was balanced.
yes. Okay, I hope we've answered all the questions. We don't have any more questions in here. If there's anything you want to know, like afterwards, you can always contact us by email and we try to help you, of
For
course.
sure.
But as I said, I'll send out the link to the YouTube playlist. And then I wish everyone who's still here good luck for your Abitur.
Very good luck.
And Lauren,
Fingers
thank you so
crossed.
much for
My
being
pleasure.
here again, doing that again. And yeah, I hope to see everyone somewhere again. Have a great evening, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.